My experience with my ex started a year ago when I was living in Chicago in a decent apartment in Lincoln Park. I had been with my girlfriend Layla for about 5 years and everything seemed fine. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but overall we were good. Or at least, I thought we were. Layla and I shared everything, including finances. We had joint accounts and she had access to my personal accounts too. We trusted each other completely, or so I thought. I was working as a software engineer and she was doing freelance graphic design. I handled most of the bills because my job was more stable and it just made sense. I never really questioned where the money was going or how much she was spending. I was busy with work and I trusted her to handle things responsibly. Things started to change about 6 months before we broke up. Layla started acting distant. She was staying out late, saying she was working on projects or meeting clients, but she wouldn't give me any details. I tried to ask her about it, but she brushed me off, saying she was just stressed and needed some space. I didn't want to push her, so I let it go. That was my first mistake. One day, out of the blue, Layla told me she wanted to break up. She said she wasn't happy, that she needed to find herself, all the usual cliches. I was shocked, but I didn't try to stop her. If she wasn't happy, I figured it was better for both of us to move on. She packed her things and left that same week. It was hard, but I tried to focus on work and move forward. After she left, I didn't immediately notice anything wrong. I was dealing with the breakup, keeping busy with work, and trying to adjust to being alone again. But about a month later, I got a notification from my bank about insufficient funds. I checked my account and saw that my balance was almost zero. I couldn't understand how it had happened. I hadn't made any big purchases, and my salary had been deposited just a few days earlier. I logged into my bank account to see what was going on, and that's when I saw it. Large withdrawals, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, and multiple charges to credit cards that I didn't even know I had. Panic set in as I realized that my account had been drained. I immediately called the bank, thinking there had been some kind of mistake or that maybe I was the victim of fraud. The bank's fraud department started an investigation, but as I went through the transactions, I noticed something chilling. Many of the charges were to places Layla frequented, restaurants, stores, even a spa she loved. My heart sank as it dawned on me that this wasn't just some random scammer. It was Layla. She had been siphoning money out of my account for months, maybe even longer. She must have been transferring it to her own accounts, using my cards to fund her lifestyle, and I hadn't noticed a thing. I had been too trusting, too distracted by work and the relationship to see what was happening right under my nose. I felt like a fool. But more than that, I felt violated. This was someone I had loved and trusted, someone I had shared my life with. And she'd been stealing from me, betraying me for who knows how long. I didn't know what to do. I was angry, but I was also scared. If she had been capable of doing this, what else could she do? I started to second-guess everything I knew about her. I contacted the police and filed a report, but they told me it was going to be a long process. They needed to gather evidence, subpoena bank records, and track down where the money had gone. They suggested I also contact a lawyer, which I did. The lawyer wasn't cheap, but I didn't have a choice. I needed help sorting out the mess Layla had left behind. As the days went by, more and more details came to light. Layla hadn't just taken money from our joint accounts. She had opened new credit cards in my name, taken out loans, and even applied for a second mortgage on the apartment without my knowledge. The amounts were staggering. I was in debt for tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. It felt like my entire financial life had been turned upside down. I had to start contacting creditors, trying to explain that these debts weren't mine. But without concrete evidence, many of them didn't believe me. They said the accounts were in my name, and as far as they were concerned, I was responsible for paying them back. It didn't matter that I hadn't signed up for any of it, or that I hadn't seen a dime of the money. I was trapped. As the investigation dragged on, my stress levels went through the roof. I couldn't focus at work. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next shoe to drop. I barely slept, and when I did, I had nightmares about losing everything. My job, my apartment, my entire life. I became paranoid, checking my accounts obsessively, scared that there would be more surprises waiting for me. One day I got a call from my lawyer. He told me that Layla had been found. She was living in a different city now, using a different name. She had apparently moved to Los Angeles and was living a completely new life, using the money she had stolen from me. The lawyer said we had enough evidence to take her to court, but that it was going to be a long, expensive battle. He asked me if I was sure I wanted to go through with it. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted justice, wanted to make her pay for what she had done, but another part of me just wanted it all to be over, to stop thinking about her, about the money, about everything. I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. I told the lawyer I needed some time to think. That night I sat in my empty apartment staring at the walls, trying to make sense of everything. I felt so alone, so helpless. It was like the life I had known was gone, replaced by this nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I thought about all the years I had spent with Layla, all the good times, all the love and trust I had given her. And now, it all felt like a lie. In the end, I decided not to pursue legal action. I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I lost a lot of money, and it took me a long time to dig myself out of the financial hole she left me in. I had to sell the apartment, move into a smaller place, and work extra hours just to stay afloat. But eventually, I started to rebuild. I still don't know if I made the right decision. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had taken her to court, if I had tried to get back what she stole from me. But then I remember how broken I felt, how desperate I was just to move on, and I think maybe I did what was best for me at the time. I don't know where Layla is now, and I don't want to know. I just hope she's not doing the same thing to someone else. As for me, I'm trying to move on, to rebuild my life one day at a time. It all started when I moved in with my boyfriend. We had been dating for about 6 months, and things seemed to be going really well. He was charming, attentive, and we had a lot of fun together. Plus, his place was pretty nice, small but cozy, in a decent neighborhood in Austin, Texas. Moving in was exciting, but also a bit stressful, as these things always are. I was lugging boxes up 3 flights of stairs, trying to organize my life into his space, but he was there helping me, and we made a bit of an adventure out of it. We ordered pizza, drank wine, and laughed as we tried to figure out where all my stuff would fit. I didn't notice anything weird at first. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The first thing that caught my attention was something so small that I almost dismissed it. I was putting up some pictures on the wall in the bedroom and noticed a tiny hole above the headboard. I'm not exactly a handy person, so I just assumed it was from a nail or screw left by the previous tenant. I mentioned it to my boyfriend and he just shrugged, saying the place was old, so there were probably a bunch of holes like that. I didn't think much of it and moved on. A few days later, I was taking a shower when I noticed another small hole in the tile grout right by the shower head. It was just a pinhole, really small, almost invisible. I ran my finger over it, but it didn't seem like anything more than wear and tear. Still, it made me pause. I started noticing more and more of these tiny holes, almost like they were following me around. In the living room, there was one near the TV. In the bathroom, there was another near the mirror. Even in the kitchen, I found one inside a cabinet. At this point, I started to feel a little uneasy. I asked my boyfriend about it again, and he kind of laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid. He joked about the place being full of personality, and said I was probably just noticing things that had always been there. But it didn't sit right with me. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't just the holes either. I started getting this weird vibe in the apartment. It was subtle, almost like an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite shake. One day, while he was at work, I decided to take a closer look at the holes. I got a small flashlight and started examining them more carefully. What I saw made my stomach drop. Inside some of the holes, there was a faint glint of metal, like something was reflecting the light. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind raced with possibilities, but one thought kept coming back. Could these be cameras? I tried to convince myself that I was being ridiculous, that I was just overthinking things. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I spent hours searching the apartment, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I checked the vents, the light fixtures, even under the furniture. I didn't find anything else suspicious, but those holes were enough to keep me up at night. I finally decided to talk to one of my friends about it. She's a bit of a tech geek, so I figured she might have some insight. When I told her what I'd found, she immediately told me to check for hidden cameras. She explained that some people use tiny cameras that can be hidden almost anywhere, and they often have lenses as small as a pinhead. She suggested using my phone's camera to scan the apartment, since hidden cameras sometimes show up as a small light on the screen when you're recording in a dark room. I felt like I was going crazy, but I decided to give it a try. I waited until it was dark outside, turned off all the lights in the apartment, and started slowly scanning the room with my phone's camera. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then, as I was scanning the bedroom, I saw it. A tiny, barely noticeable flicker on my screen, right where one of the holes was. My heart started pounding. I moved closer, trying to see if I could get a better look, and there it was again. A small, almost imperceptible glint, like the reflection off a lens. I was in full panic mode. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront my boyfriend? Should I call the police? My mind was racing, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. But more than anything, I felt violated. If there were cameras in the apartment, that meant someone had been watching me, in the most private moments of my life. The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. I decided not to confront my boyfriend right away. I needed more information, and I wanted to be sure before I did anything drastic. The next day, I took a day off work and went to a hardware store to buy a small toolkit. I wanted to see what was behind those holes. When I got back to the apartment, I waited until my boyfriend left for work, then I started carefully unscrewing the cover plate around one of the holes in the bedroom. My hands were shaking as I worked the screwdriver, and I had to take a few deep breaths to calm myself down. When I finally got the cover plate off, I saw it. A small, round camera lens embedded in the wall. It was so well hidden that if I hadn't been looking for it, I never would have found it. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I immediately checked the other holes in the apartment, and sure enough, I found more cameras. I sat on the floor, staring at the cameras in my hands, trying to process what I'd just found. I couldn't believe it. My boyfriend, the person I trusted most, had been spying on me. I felt like my entire world had just been turned upside down. All the little things that hadn't made sense before started clicking into place. The way he always seemed to know what I was doing, even when I hadn't told him. The way he would sometimes mention things that I knew I hadn't shared with him. It all made sense now, and it made me feel completely exposed and vulnerable. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment. I couldn't even look at my boyfriend without feeling disgusted. But I also knew that I needed to be careful about how I handled this. I didn't know what he was capable of, and I didn't want to put myself in any more danger. I decided to pack a bag and leave while he was still at work. I called my friend, the same one I'd talked to about the cameras, and told her everything. She offered to let me stay with her for as long as I needed, and I took her up on it. Before I left, I made sure to take pictures of the cameras and the holes they were hidden in. I wanted to have evidence in case I needed it later. Then I grabbed my essentials, stuffed them into a duffel bag, and got the hell out of there. I didn't leave a note, and I didn't tell him where I was going. I just wanted to disappear. I ended up going to the police a few days later. I brought the cameras with me, along with the pictures I'd taken. They took my statement and said they would investigate, but I didn't have much hope that anything would come of it. After I left the apartment, my boyfriend tried to contact me multiple times. He called, texted, even showed up at my friend's place once. But I refused to see him. I didn't want to hear his excuses or explanations. As far as I was concerned, he was dead to me. I ended up changing my phone number and blocking him on social media. I wanted to cut all ties and put the whole thing behind me, but it's not that simple. Even now, I still check every new place I stay for hidden cameras. It's like a piece of my peace of mind was stolen, and I don't know if I'll ever get it back. This happened about a year ago. I was living in Seattle at the time, working at a marketing firm downtown. I had just ended a relationship with my boyfriend of 2 years. The breakup wasn't anything dramatic. We had just drifted apart, and it felt like the right time to go our separate ways. We agreed to stay friends, and things seemed to end on good terms, or so I thought. After we broke up, I noticed my ex around more than usual. He would pop up at places we used to go together, coffee shops, the gym, even at a few bars we liked. I figured it was just a coincidence at first. Seattle isn't a huge city, and we lived relatively close to each other. Seeing him here and there didn't seem too strange. I would just give him a nod or a wave and go about my day. But then it started happening more often. I'd be grabbing a coffee before work, and there he'd be, sitting in the corner with his laptop. I'd go for a run around Green Lake, and he'd be jogging on the same path. At first, I just assumed we had similar routines, but it started to feel like he was everywhere I went. Still, I convinced myself that I was overthinking it. We had a lot of the same interests, so it wasn't too crazy that we'd end up in the same places. Then one day I was at work and I got a text from him. He mentioned that he'd seen me on my lunch break, asking why I didn't say hi. I remember feeling a chill go down my spine. I had eaten my lunch at a small park a few blocks from the office, a place we never went together. I hadn't seen him there, but apparently he had seen me. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just another coincidence, but the texts kept coming. Every day, he would send me a message referencing something I had done that day, places I'd been, people I'd seen, even what I was wearing. It was like he had a front row seat to my life, and the more it happened, the more uneasy I became. I started looking over my shoulder, checking to see if he was around, but I never actually caught him in the act of following me. After about a week of this, I decided to confront him. I texted him back, asking how he seemed to know so much about my day-to-day life. He responded casually, saying that he just happened to be in the same places as me, and that it was funny how often our paths crossed. He tried to make it sound like a joke, but it didn't feel like one to me. It felt like something darker, something that wasn't just about chance encounters. I started changing my routine. I'd go to different coffee shops, take different routes to work, even switch up my workout times. But no matter what I did, he always seemed to know where I was. His texts would reference my new locations as if he were daring me to shake him off. It was like a game to him, but for me, it was quickly becoming a living nightmare. One day, I decided to leave work early. I figured I could get out before he had a chance to track me down, maybe get some time to myself without feeling like I was under surveillance. I made it to my car, glancing around nervously, but I didn't see him anywhere. I drove to a little cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place I'd never been before, and settled into a corner with a book, trying to relax. Not even 20 minutes later, I got a text from him. He asked what I was reading, mentioning the cafe by name. My heart dropped. I looked around, but I couldn't see him. It felt like he was a ghost, always just out of sight, but always watching. I left immediately, my hands shaking as I drove back to my apartment. By this point, I was terrified. It was clear that he was stalking me, but I didn't know what to do. I hadn't seen him physically do anything threatening, but the way he was tracking my every move felt like a threat in itself. I started avoiding going out altogether, spending most of my time holed up in my apartment. But even then, the texts kept coming, and they were becoming more invasive. One night, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when my phone buzzed. It was a message from him, saying that I looked peaceful when I slept. I remember feeling my blood run cold. I was in my apartment, my curtains drawn, the door locked. There was no way he could see me, but somehow he knew. I barely slept that night. I was convinced he was somehow inside. The next day, I went to the police. I brought my phone, showing them the texts, explaining everything that had been happening. They listened, but their response was less than reassuring. They told me that unless he made a direct threat or I could prove he was physically stalking me, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I get a restraining order, but I knew that would only provoke him further. The whole thing felt hopeless. That weekend, I decided to get out of the city for a bit. I went to visit my parents in Olympia, thinking that putting some distance between us might give me a chance to breathe. But even there, the texts continued. He sent me messages about places I had been around town, things I had done even though I hadn't seen him once. It was like he had eyes everywhere and there was no escaping him. When I got back to Seattle, I noticed a car parked near my apartment that I hadn't seen before. It was there almost every time I came home, but I never saw anyone inside. It didn't have any identifiable markings, but something about it made me uneasy. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, but by this point, everything felt like a potential threat. I finally reached a breaking point one evening when I was walking home from work. It was late, the streets were quiet, and I had my hood up to shield myself from the drizzle. As I turned the corner to my street, I saw him standing there, just a few feet from my building. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking at me with a smile that made my skin crawl. I froze, feeling trapped. He didn't move toward me, didn't say anything, just watched as I walked past him, fumbling with my keys to get inside as quickly as possible. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I peeked through the peephole, but he was gone. I didn't know what to do. I felt completely powerless, like no matter what I did, he would always be one step ahead. It was a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone. I ended up calling my best friend, telling her everything. She insisted that I stay with her for a while, and I took her up on the offer. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. Moving in with her gave me some peace of mind, but it didn't stop the texts. They kept coming, always hinting that he knew where I was and what I was doing. Eventually, I decided to change jobs. I figured if I wasn't going to the same places anymore, maybe he wouldn't be able to keep up with me. I found a new job in Tacoma and moved in with my parents for a bit to save up some money. The texts started to slow down after that, and I finally began to feel like I was getting some of my life back. A few years ago, I had secured a position at a marketing firm in San Francisco. A job I had landed after a few years of bouncing around different positions. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and office gossip was just a part of daily life. I'd been there for a couple of years and had built up a decent reputation. I was good at my job, I got along with my co-workers, and I was generally well-liked. Life was good, or at least it seemed that way. Then I met Dave. He was a new hire, brought on to work in a different department, but our paths crossed often enough that we started talking. He was charming in that way that made you want to be friends with him right away. Funny, easy to talk to, and always seemed to know the right thing to say. We started hanging out outside of work, grabbing drinks after a long day, and eventually we started dating. It wasn't anything serious at first, just casual, but things progressed quickly. Everything seemed fine for the first few months. We were spending a lot of time together, both at work and outside of it, but then things started to change. Dave began to show signs of jealousy, but I brushed it off as nothing serious. He'd get irritated if I talked to certain coworkers or if I stayed late at the office. At first, I thought it was just because he cared, but soon enough, his behavior started to feel suffocating. He was always questioning where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. After about 6 months, I decided it was too much. I ended things with him, thinking that would be the end of it. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Dave didn't take the breakup well. At first, it was just awkward at work. Seeing him in the hallways or during meetings, he wouldn't look at me, wouldn't acknowledge me, but that was better than the alternative. Then the rumors started. I began hearing whispers around the office, people saying that I was difficult to work with, that I was unreliable, that I wasn't as good at my job as everyone thought. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard. It felt like people were looking at me differently, like they were judging me without even knowing why. It didn't take long for the rumors to escalate. I started noticing that my projects were being tampered with. Emails I had sent to clients were suddenly missing. Files I needed for presentations were gone, and work I had completed was somehow undone. I couldn't figure out what was happening. I double-checked everything, thinking maybe I was just making mistakes, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Then my boss called me into his office. He told me that there had been complaints about my work, that clients were unhappy, and that I wasn't meeting deadlines. I was stunned. I had always been meticulous, never missed a deadline, and had always had good relationships with clients. I tried to explain that I didn't know what was going on, that there must be some kind of mistake, but he wasn't having it. He warned me that if things didn't improve, I might be let go. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what was happening. It felt like my whole world was unraveling and I didn't know how to stop it. That night I went home and cried, feeling more alone than I had in a long time. The next day at work, things got even worse. I found out that personal emails between me and friends had been forwarded to my boss. The emails were twisted to make it look like I was bad-mouthing the company, saying things that I would never say. I was called into HR and reprimanded for being unprofessional. They didn't believe me when I told them I hadn't sent those emails, that someone must have hacked into my account. I started to feel like I was going crazy. I couldn't prove that someone was messing with me, but I knew it had to be Dave. There was no one else who could have done it, no one else who had a reason to ruin my life. But without evidence, I couldn't go to HR or the police. I was trapped, and it was terrifying. Then one day I came into the office and found my desk in disarray. Papers were scattered everywhere, my computer was unplugged, and everything was a mess. But the worst part was a sticky note stuck to my monitor. It had just 2 words. I know. That was the breaking point for me. I felt sick to my stomach, the fear overwhelming me. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I took a leave of absence, telling my boss that I needed some time off for personal reasons. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I just packed a bag and left the city, heading to stay with family for a while. I spent the next few weeks in a state of constant anxiety. Eventually, I went back to San Francisco, but I didn't return to that job. I couldn't. The thought of walking back into that office, of seeing Dave again, was too much to bear. I found a new job in a different part of the city, cut ties with most of my old coworkers, and tried to start fresh. But the damage was done. My reputation had been destroyed, and I was constantly paranoid that Dave would somehow find a way to ruin this new life I was trying to build. I still don't know how he managed to do everything he did without leaving any trace, without giving me anything I could use to fight back. It's like he was always one step ahead of me, always knew exactly how to push me to the edge. And the worst part is, I can't prove any of it. This happened when I was living in San Diego, working in sales for a tech company. I'd been dating this girl for about 2 years. Things were great in the beginning, but as time went on, we started having more and more problems. We fought a lot, mostly about little things that would escalate into bigger arguments. We just weren't on the same page anymore, and I realized that the relationship wasn't healthy for either of us. So after a particularly bad fight, I decided to end it. She didn't take it well. She was upset, angry, and accused me of giving up on us. But I thought it was over. I thought that in time she would move on, and so would I. For a while, it seemed like that was happening. We stopped talking, and I focused on work and getting my life back on track. But that's when the real nightmare began. A few weeks after the breakup, I started getting strange phone calls. At first, it was just a few here and there, numbers I didn't recognize, but nothing unusual. I assumed they were spam or wrong numbers, but then the calls started getting more frequent and more disturbing. I was getting calls in the middle of the night from people I didn't know, saying all kinds of weird things. Some were angry, some were crude, and some were just plain creepy. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Then, one day, I got a call from a guy who sounded furious. He demanded to know why I had been harassing his girlfriend, accusing me of sending her explicit messages and photos. I was completely taken aback. I had no idea what he was talking about. I tried to explain that he had the wrong person, but he wasn't having it. He kept yelling at me until I finally hung up, feeling shaken and confused. The calls kept coming and they were getting worse. I started getting text messages too, random numbers sending me graphic pictures, abusive messages, and threats. It felt like I was being attacked from all sides and I had no idea why. Then I started getting packages delivered to my apartment, things I hadn't ordered, like explicit toys and other explicit items. It was humiliating. I couldn't understand who would be doing this or why. It wasn't until I got a call from a woman who told me that she had found my number on a dating site that I started to piece things together. She said she had seen my profile and wanted to meet up. I told her that I wasn't on any dating sites and asked her to send me a screenshot of the profile. When I saw it, my heart sank. There was my picture, my name, my address, and my phone number, along with a bunch of explicit details that I had never written. It was clearly a fake profile, but it was out there for anyone to see. That's when it hit me. This had to be my ex. She was the only one who had access to my pictures and personal information. She must have created the fake profiles and posted my information online as a way to get back at me for breaking up with her. It was her revenge, and it was working. My life was turning into a living hell. I tried to report the profiles to the dating sites, but it was like playing whack-a-mole. Every time I got one taken down, another one would pop up. It wasn't just dating sites either. She had posted my information on revenge forums, chat rooms, and even Craigslist. People were contacting me from all over the place, thinking I was someone I wasn't. It felt like there was no escape. I started getting harassed at work too. People were calling my office, leaving obscene messages, and even sending emails to my colleagues. My boss pulled me aside one day and asked if there was something going on that he should know about. I tried to explain what was happening, but it sounded so insane that I wasn't sure he believed me. All I knew was that my professional reputation was taking a hit because of it. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if she was going to show up somewhere or escalate things even further. I started avoiding social media altogether, deleting my accounts and trying to disappear online. But it was like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. The damage was already done, and it felt like there was no way to fully undo it. One night, I came home to find that someone had keyed my car. Deep scratches ran along the side and my tires had been slashed. I had no proof that it was her, but I had no doubt in my mind. I reported it to the police, but without any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They took my statement, but I could tell they didn't think much would come of it. My personal life was in shambles. I was afraid to date anyone new, worried that they might get caught up in the mess that my life had become. My friendships were strained because I didn't want to talk about what was happening, and I felt like I was dragging everyone else down with my problems. I was isolated, constantly stressed, and unsure of how to make it stop. I tried getting a restraining order, but it turned out to be more complicated than I expected. The police said that since there hadn't been any direct threats or physical violence, it would be hard to get one granted. They advised me to keep documenting everything, but it felt like a losing battle. Meanwhile, the harassment continued, and I felt more and more trapped. The worst part was not knowing when it would end. I kept hoping that she would get bored or find something else to focus on, but the harassment dragged on for months. It was like living under a dark cloud that never went away. I started having trouble sleeping, and my work performance suffered because I couldn't concentrate. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next thing to happen. Finally, after months, the harassment started to taper off. The calls and messages became less frequent, and the fake profiles stopped appearing as often. I don't know if she finally moved on or if she found someone else to target, but I was just relieved that it seemed to be slowing down. I took every precaution I could think of to protect myself, changing my phone number, moving to a new apartment, and keeping my personal information as private as possible. I was living in Portland at the time. I'd just come out of a short relationship with this guy named Alex. We'd met online, like most people do these days, and things moved quickly. At first, everything seemed normal. We went on a few dates, he seemed sweet, and after a month or so, we were officially dating. He wasn't the love of my life or anything, but we had a good time together. He wasn't clingy, and I liked that, at least at first. Things started to feel off pretty quickly, though. Alex became more intense, more possessive in ways I didn't see coming. He'd ask who I was with every time I went out, even if it was just for coffee with a friend. He'd ask for constant updates about what I was doing, and if I didn't reply right away, he'd flood my phone with messages. At first, I thought it was just him being over-attentive, but as it went on, I realized it wasn't normal. I started feeling suffocated. After about 3 months, I told him we needed to break up. He took it way worse than I expected. He didn't cry or yell, but he just kept asking over and over why I was ending it, like he couldn't believe it was happening. I tried to explain that I just wasn't feeling it anymore, that it wasn't working, but he kept pushing for more, like there had to be another reason. I finally had to be blunt and say it was over, no more talking about it. He went quiet after that. I expected him to block me or stop talking to me altogether, but that's not what happened. A couple of days after the breakup, I noticed him standing outside my apartment building. I lived in a pretty quiet neighborhood, and it wasn't the kind of place you just happened to pass by. He was standing on the corner, just there. He didn't try to come in or anything, and he wasn't looking up at my window, but I saw him. It creeped me out, but I figured maybe he was just dealing with the breakup badly and didn't know what to do with himself. I stayed inside, didn't confront him, and eventually he left. I tried not to think too much about it, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me. A few days after that, I started seeing him everywhere. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Portland isn't huge, but it's big enough that running into someone randomly doesn't happen that often. But I'd see him at my grocery store, sitting a few tables away at the coffee shop I went to every morning, even at the gym. And it wasn't just once or twice, it was often enough that I knew it wasn't a coincidence. He never said anything, never approached me, but he was always there, just close enough to make me feel uncomfortable. I remember one afternoon I was walking to meet a friend for lunch downtown. It was one of those rainy, gray Portland days, and I was already feeling a bit off because I hadn't slept well. I was walking down Burnside Street when I noticed someone behind me. I didn't think much of it at first, but after a couple of blocks, I realized it was Alex. He was walking about 50 feet behind me, trying to keep his distance, but I knew it was him. My stomach dropped. I turned the corner and ducked into a little shop, waiting inside for a few minutes. When I stepped out, he was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me, even if I couldn't see him anymore. Over the next couple of weeks, things got worse. It wasn't just the random sightings anymore. He started showing up at my apartment building more regularly, standing outside, not doing anything but making his presence known. Sometimes I'd see him in the evening, standing across the street in the rain, just staring at the building. He never tried to talk to me or come closer, but I knew what he was doing. He wanted me to know he was there, that he was still thinking about me. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking that maybe if I didn't give him the attention he wanted, he'd stop. But it didn't work. I started getting text messages from unknown numbers. At first, they were short, things like, "I miss you," or "Why won't you talk to me?" Then they got more aggressive. Messages telling me that I couldn't just ignore him, that I couldn't pretend he didn't exist. I blocked every number, but new ones kept coming. It started to mess with my head. I didn't feel safe anymore, not in my own apartment, not walking around my neighborhood. I couldn't shake the fear that he was watching me, that he was waiting for me to let my guard down. Every time I left my building, I'd scan the street, looking for him, and more often than not, I'd see him standing there watching. He never made a move to talk to me, never came too close, but he was always there, just on the edge of my life, making sure I couldn't forget about him. One night I came home late after hanging out with a couple of friends. I'd stayed at their place longer than usual because I didn't want to walk back alone in the dark. I was already on edge when I got to my apartment, and when I turned the corner onto my street, I saw Alex standing in front of my building. This time, he wasn't just across the street or at the corner. He was standing right by the entrance, like he was waiting for me to come home. I froze. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just walk past him, and I didn't want to run either in case that set him off. He saw me, of course, but he didn't move. He just stared at me like he was daring me to come closer. I turned around and started walking back the way I'd come, hoping he wouldn't follow. My hands were shaking as I called a friend, asking if I could stay at their place for the night. I didn't go home that night, and the next morning, when I returned to my apartment, he was gone. After that, I finally went to the police. I didn't want to. Something about it felt dramatic, like I was blowing things out of proportion, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I told them everything that had been happening, and they suggested I get a restraining order, but even then they warned me that it wouldn't necessarily stop him from showing up. I felt hopeless, like no one could really help me. I ended up talking to my landlord and explained the situation. He was sympathetic and agreed to let me break my lease early. I packed up my things, found a new place across town, changed my phone number, deleted my old email, and made new social media accounts under a different name. I tried to disappear, to start fresh somewhere where Alex couldn't find me. It's been over a year since I last saw Alex. About a year and a half ago, I went through something that felt like it was straight out of a nightmare. I was living in Chicago at the time, working as a graphic designer. I'd been dating this girl for almost a year. Things started out great, as they usually do. We met through mutual friends, hit it off, and started spending more and more time together. She was funny, smart, and seemed genuinely interested in me and my life. We quickly became close, and it felt like we were really in sync. But after about 9 months, things started to go south. I started noticing that she was lying about small things. At first, it was just little white lies, things that didn't seem to matter much. What time she got off work, who she was hanging out with. But as time went on, the lies got bigger. She'd say she was at one place when she was actually at another, or she'd claim she was doing something that didn't quite add up. I confronted her about it a few times, but she always had an excuse ready or would turn the conversation around to make me feel like I was being paranoid or controlling. Eventually, it became too much. I couldn't trust her, and without trust, there was no way the relationship could work. So I ended it. She didn't take it well, but she didn't make a scene either. She just left my apartment one evening and that was it. Or so I thought. For a couple of months after the breakup, everything seemed fine. I got back into my routine, started seeing friends more, and focused on my work. I wasn't really thinking about her anymore, just trying to move on with my life. But then, strange things started happening. It all started with a credit card bill. I got a statement in the mail for a card I didn't recognize. I figured it was just a mistake, maybe a mix-up with someone else's mail, but when I opened it, I saw that it had my name on it, along with a balance of over $2,000. I hadn't opened any new credit cards recently, and I definitely hadn't spent that kind of money. My first thought was that it was some kind of error, so I called the credit card company to straighten it out. What they told me made my stomach drop. The account had been opened in my name, using my social security number and other personal information. Someone had racked up thousands of dollars in charges, clothes, electronics, even plane tickets. I told them it wasn't me, that I hadn't opened the account, but they insisted that all the information matched mine. They advised me to report it as identity theft, which I did immediately. I spent the next few days on the phone with credit card companies, my bank, and even the police, trying to figure out what had happened and how to fix it. I thought it was just a one-time thing, but as more bills started rolling in, I realized it was much worse than I initially thought. In total, 3 new credit cards had been opened in my name, and together they had racked up almost $10,000 in debt. My credit score, which had been decent before, was suddenly tanking. I felt like my life was spiraling out of control. I couldn't believe this was happening to me, and I had no idea who could have done it. It wasn't until I got a call from one of the credit card companies that I started to put the pieces together. They told me they needed to verify some information and asked me a series of security questions. One of the questions was about a specific purchase, something I had never bought. When I asked them where the item had been delivered, they gave me an address that I recognized immediately. It was my ex-girlfriend's address. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. She had done this. Somehow she had gotten hold of my personal information, my social security number, my driver's license, my bank details, and used it to open these accounts. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't understand how someone I had trusted, someone I had cared about, could do something so malicious. But the evidence was staring me in the face. I went back to the police with this new information, but they didn't seem too hopeful about catching her. Identity theft cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the person involved is someone you know. They took my report and said they'd look into it, but they warned me not to expect much. In the meantime, I was left to clean up the mess she had made. I had to dispute every charge on the fraudulent accounts, which was a long and frustrating process. Some of the companies were sympathetic and closed the accounts, but others were less cooperative, insisting that I was responsible for the debt until proven otherwise. It felt like I was banging my head against a wall, trying to prove that I wasn't the one who had spent all that money. My financial situation took a nosedive. I had to freeze my credit, which meant I couldn't apply for any new credit cards or loans. My existing accounts were flagged for fraud, so even using my legitimate credit cards became a hassle. I was constantly worried about what other damage she might have done that I hadn't discovered yet. It was like living in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next bombshell was going to drop. And it wasn't just the financial impact. The emotional toll was just as bad, if not worse. I couldn't stop thinking about how she had been able to do this to me. I kept replaying our relationship in my mind, trying to figure out when she had gotten my information, what signs I might have missed. It made me paranoid, not just about her, but about everyone. I started to question everyone's motives, wondering if I could really trust anyone ever again. I also felt incredibly ashamed. I didn't want to tell anyone what had happened because I felt like it was my fault, like I should have been more careful or noticed something sooner. It wasn't until I confided in a close friend that I realized how isolated I had become. He was shocked and supportive, but he also urged me to see a therapist to help deal with the emotional fallout. I took his advice, and it was one of the best decisions I made during that time. Therapy helped me start to process everything that had happened and come to terms with the fact that this wasn't my fault. My ex had manipulated me and taken advantage of my trust, and while that was a hard pill to swallow, it wasn't something I could have predicted. It took a long time to accept that, but eventually, I started to feel a little more like myself again. As for the financial side of things, it was a long, drawn-out battle. I had to hire a lawyer to help me navigate the mess and deal with the credit card companies that were being difficult. It took months of back and forth, but eventually I was able to get most of the fraudulent accounts closed and the charges reversed. My credit score is still recovering, but it's slowly getting better. I never saw my ex again after that. She disappeared from my life as completely as she could, and part of me is glad for that. I don't know where she is now, and I don't want to know. All I care about is putting this whole ordeal behind me and trying to rebuild what she tore apart. I want to share something that happened to me that has been messing with my head for a long time now. It all started about 2 years ago, right after I ended things with my ex, Mark. We had been together for almost 3 years, but things had been rocky for a while. The breakup wasn't anything dramatic, no big fights or anything like that. We just weren't working anymore, and it was time to move on. At least that's what I thought. For the first few weeks after the breakup, things were surprisingly normal. I was dealing with the usual stuff, sadness, loneliness, trying to distract myself with work and friends. I work in tech, so I'm always on my computer, and social media is just part of my life. At the time, I was living in Seattle, and most of my friends were there too. I leaned on them a lot to get through those initial weeks, but soon enough I started to feel a little better, like I was finally moving on. That's when things started to get weird. It was subtle at first, just small things I could easily brush off. My friends started telling me about weird messages they were getting from me on Facebook. It was mostly random stuff. Old photos of us, weird comments on their posts, strange private messages. I hadn't sent any of them, and I figured it was a hack. I changed my password and thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, I noticed that some of my own posts on Instagram were different. Old photos had been edited with strange captions that I definitely didn't write. Some were just weird, like a picture of me at Pike Place Market with the caption, "Missing you already." Others were more unsettling, like a selfie I took in my apartment with the caption, "All alone, no one to protect me." It freaked me out, but I thought maybe my account had been hacked again. I went through all the steps, changed my password, set up two-factor authentication, everything. But it kept happening. I was starting to feel paranoid, like I was losing control of my own life online. My friends would tell me about more messages they'd received from me, some of them innocent enough, but others were more personal, even intimate. Messages that sounded like something Mark would say to me when we were still together. That's when I started to suspect it was him. He was always pretty good with computers, and it wouldn't have been impossible for him to figure out how to get into my accounts, especially since we'd shared passwords before. But when I confronted him about it, he denied everything. He acted hurt that I would even accuse him, saying that he'd moved on and that I should too. I wanted to believe him, but something didn't sit right. It was just too coincidental. Still, without any proof, there wasn't much I could do. I felt stuck, like I was fighting a ghost that no one else could see. Then it got worse. One morning, I woke up to find that all of my social media accounts had been completely taken over. My profile pictures were changed to some creepy photos of me sleeping. Photos I had never taken and had no idea how anyone could have gotten. My Facebook cover photo was a picture of my apartment building taken from the street. It was like someone was watching me, documenting my life without me knowing. The captions and posts were getting more aggressive, talking about how lonely I was, how no one really cared about me, how I was nothing without Mark. I was terrified. I deleted my accounts immediately. It felt like cutting off a part of my life, but I couldn't deal with the idea that someone had that kind of access to me. I called the police, but they were dismissive. Without any real evidence or direct threats, they couldn't do much. I was told to be careful and to document anything else that happened. But that wasn't reassuring at all. I tried to go about my life without social media, but it was harder than I expected. Everything felt off balance. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking around the corner. I changed the locks on my apartment, even though I had no real reason to believe someone had been inside. About a week after I deleted my accounts, I started receiving emails. They were from an anonymous address, but the messages were clearly meant for me. The first one was just a single sentence. "Miss seeing you online." Then they got more detailed. The sender knew things about me that no one else should have known. What I was wearing that day, where I had gone, who I had been with. They even mentioned my new job at a startup downtown, a job I hadn't told anyone about yet. It was like they were inside my head, or worse, inside my life. I became paranoid. I stopped going out unless I had to, and when I did, I stuck to crowded places. I didn't feel safe in my own apartment, so I crashed at friends' places as often as I could. But the emails kept coming, getting more and more personal, more invasive. They talked about things I had done in the past, things I had never shared with anyone, not even Mark. It was like this person knew me better than I knew myself. I was unraveling. My work started to suffer because I couldn't focus on anything other than the fear that was eating me alive. I was constantly on edge, always looking for something out of place, some sign that whoever was doing this was close. But there was never anything concrete, just this creeping sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Then came the night that broke me. I had just gotten home from work, and I was exhausted. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks, and it was starting to take its toll. I remember collapsing onto my bed, hoping for just a few hours of peace. But when I pulled back the covers, there was a piece of paper lying on my pillow. My heart stopped. It was a printed photo of me from that very morning, leaving my apartment. On the back, someone had written, "Sleep tight." I lost it. I ran out of the apartment without even thinking, without taking anything with me. I drove straight to a friend's house and stayed there for days. I couldn't go back. I knew whoever had been watching me wasn't just online anymore. They were in my real life, closer than I could have ever imagined. I called the police again, but they were just as unhelpful as before. They told me to keep the photo as evidence, but that was it. I knew I couldn't stay in Seattle anymore. I had to get away, start over somewhere far from there. I packed up my things, left my apartment, and moved across the country to Boston. I changed my phone number, got a new email address, and stayed off social media completely. I thought maybe if I cut myself off from everything, whoever was doing this would finally leave me alone. For a while, it worked. I found a new apartment, a new job, and started to feel like maybe I could put it all behind me. But even now, every so often, I'll get this feeling like I'm being watched, like someone is just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. I don't use social media anymore, and I've cut ties with a lot of people from my past just to keep myself safe. I've done everything I can to move on, but the fear never really goes away. I don't know if it ever will. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.